To tell you a little bit about myself, I bring some, I think, unique pieces to this. First off, I am on the spectrum. So I'm going to be giving you the view of a person that you would be dealing with as neurodiverse. And it's very possible that my view might be a little different than you're going to hear from people who just manage the neurodiverse. And that's one of the problems that we have, of course, is trying to understand the neurodiverse so that we can properly and do a good job at helping support them. In my background, I've had about 30 years of business career. I've had 20 years of IT career, with 12 of it being consulting, which has allowed me to be in and out of a huge number of companies and see all the different ways that people handle us neurodiverse. And then the third part is, of course, being on the spectrum, which I think gives a kind of a really unique view. And my hope is when you get to the end that you almost kind of have a little view inside my head of how things go on in there, which might be scary. I guess let's, next on the slide. I'm going to be talking about kind of working with the neurodiverse, and I will probably be jumping around a little bit in the way that you might think of it, but it's the way it kind of came together in my mind is the best way to express the issues, the challenges, the upsides, the downsides as I see them. So just go with the flow, and at the end we'll take care of anything that I might have missed. So next. I was sitting out in my car and I was holding my cell phone and I was just shaking, and I was in the parking lot at work, and I knew I needed to call my wife, and I was hoping she wouldn't answer, but I dialed the phone and she says, "Hi, hon." "I've got bad news. I just got fired." You see, I'm a technical worker, and just like most of the other technical workers out there. And as a matter of fact, I'd even say, yes, I am a geek too. And like many technical type workers, I do have Asperger's. Let's go to the next. Now, Asperger's does have some advantages to it. And first off, it's kind of a, pretty good group to be hanging out with. The left-hand side are just some famous people who are believed or known to be on the Asperger spectrum. And it isn't just technical. That's why I put Robin Williams in there. It's also a lot of people could come from the arts areas also. And what you see on the other side are some of the things that I've been able to do with the unique skills that Asperger's has given me. And those were all products that I actually invented and started a manufacturing company and distributed and sold around the world. So you can see there's definitely some upside to having somebody like me around. I wasn't trained as an engineer or a designer. I just picked up the book and learned it because it was exciting. Next. I'm going to be using a term here that probably you've never heard before, because I think we invented this term. And I refer to it as being like a Hollywood A-lister. And when you think of a Hollywood A-lister, what comes to mind? I mean, you think about amazing talent, but you also tend to think about they're kind of babies and they're temperamental and they can be difficult to deal with. And guess what? What I call ASD listers are really the same thing in the technology world. We have a lot of those same traits and tendencies that the Hollywood A-listers have. And that can certainly cause problems for lots of the world out there. And the reason that I use ASD listers instead of one of the more medical terms is what I've found, and I think you'll see and recognize as you go along, that there's a lot of people who may technically not actually be diagnosable as being on the spectrum, but they display a huge amount of traits that would be considered spectrum traits. The way I like to think about it is, if you were to take and put them all in one room, you probably couldn't tell one from the other unless you were a psychiatrist. And that's what I refer to as ASD lister. So we're really saying not necessarily diagnosable, but they look just like they may as well be. Let's go to the next. I just wanted to cover a little bit of some of the terms that I'm going to be using, because I'm going to be kind of jumping back and forth around between the terms. and figured best to explain the way that I think of them, because that is one of the communication problems that we run into with the neurodiverse, is we think of things differently than you think of things. We use the same word, but we got different pictures in each of our heads. There was a disease that was called autism, and there was a disease that was called Asperger's. And they've been combined now into this thing that we call ASD, or Autism Spectrum Disorder. Then you have something that's called HFA, which is high functioning autism, and Asperger's. And all that really is the more gifted, less challenged end of the neurodiverse, what I like to call cloud, not spectrum or continuum, and we'll get more into that. Now, it's thought that this is all caused by the way that our brains are wired and shaped that cause us to have these conditions and think the way that we do, which kind of leads us into neurodiversity, which should be the next slide. To make sense of that, I'm actually going to do it here on the board and kind of break that down and explain it. And I had a real fun time last night. I found all of my color markers, so I got to make it a little more colorful than it used to be. What this is trying to represent is, I think often when we think of neurodiverse, we think of it as a continuum where we have neurotypicals on one end and we have neurodiverse on the other, and you're just somewhere in between. And I think that's very, very misleading, because it doesn't really work that way. I like to think of it more as if it's a big universe. Now, I'm not a great artist, so I don't know how you draw a universe, so I drew a cloud instead. So think of my cloud like it's a whole universe. It's got some depth to it. And what all these little marks inside of it are representing is it's representing all the different combinations of ways that human brains can be, which, again, that it drives how we perceive and process. And when you look at this, and I'm not sure if it comes through real on the camera or not, you can kind of almost see that there's this group right here that's got a lot of that kind of bright purple color in it. And if we kind of outline that group, we just got a big chunk in there. And we put them together because they're similar, and that's actually what we would refer to as being the neurotypicals. It's not that they're unique or that they're special, it's just that they tend to represent the majority of what humans show up like. You know, if you put every human in a bag and pulled one out, you're probably going to get a neurotypical. Then neurodiverse is more like this. It's simply everything that's outside of neurotypical. And I think you can see this is a really different way to think about it than to think of as it going from neurodiverse to neurotypical, that as you get closer here, you don't have any of those traits there. Because you can see, again, if you look in here, there's kind of some purple, so in neurodiverse, we're seeing there's kind of one grouping in there, and maybe that's Asperger's. And then, you know, we hunt around, we could probably find another grouping, and, you know, maybe that is ADHD. And then there's all kinds of traits that don't even have names. They're just not typical. So the big thing that I really want you to get out of this is it doesn't work from one end to the other. There's a big intermix between all of the different traits, because you can see there's traits that, you know, the blue traits out here, the blue traits in there. So you can share traits. You can have some neurodiverse traits show up among the neurotypicals and some neurotypical traits show up among the neurodiverse. And that's why I say it doesn't work as a continuum, and I like this cloud concept a lot better, of just pointing out there's these different groups, and the further apart the groups get, it's simply the harder to communicate because they perceive and process things differently. I think next slide now. I'm going to tell you a little story that comes out of my personal life, which might help illustrate how wide the variance can be between how somebody who's neurotypical and how somebody that's neurodiverse actually thinks. And this deals with bread. I, like a lot of people on the spectrum, have a tendency to get in a rut of what I eat. I don't call it a rut, I just call it a convenience. And I was into this one potato bread for my roast beef sandwiches. And we'd go to the grocery store, and with my wife and I, we'd go shopping, and I would walk into the aisle, and I would be going and reading up and down, trying to find my brand of potato bread. And almost inevitably, my wife would suddenly just point and go, honey, it's over there. And I'd walk over sheepishly, grab the bread, throw it in the cart, and off we'd go. This went on for 1.5 years. And finally, I just couldn't handle it anymore. I just needed to know, how did she do that? I mean, I read pretty quick. And she said, oh, it's real simple. I look at the orange circle that's on the end of the label, and there's only 2 brands that have that. I never noticed it. Once you pointed to it, I can see the color perfectly fine. I don't have any color blindness, but I don't process the color. It's just not part of what I perceive in the world unless I'm at an art museum or somebody's pointing out the color. I just kind of ignore it. And to me, the words were where the information was. So I think you can see that's a really big spread between how to look at things. Looking at the words or looking at just kind of what the shape and pattern is to identify it. And in this case, my wife's more neurotypical approach was 1,000 times better than the way I was trying to get the job done. Let's go to the next. This is the best way I've been able to create and come up with to illustrate both where and how a person that is on the neurodiverse spectrum is challenged, and to compare that to somebody who is not neurodiverse. And the 2 that are up there, obviously I'm Tim, the tech side, and Karen is my wife. And she has a phenomenally deep business career and is pretty normal for a person you would be dealing with that would be from the business side of a company. The way that you interpret these charts is the more blue you see, the more challenge that there is in that particular area. So when you just look quick, you can see I got a lot more challenges I'm dealing with than my wife does. But, you know, like every human, you know, my wife does have challenges, but they're at a relatively low level. When they're broken down in the 2 bottom pictures, which label communication and the social personal, you can see the only place that she really has much challenge is on the social side, and that's she's a little bit introverted and doesn't feel comfortable going into crowds where she doesn't know the people. And that's really her only big challenge. Other than that, she gets by in society and communicates and does all that stuff really, really well. When you go over to my side, though, you can see part of why I can be what I refer to as the undercover Aspie. When you look down in the communication quadrant on the bottom left, you can see I have some areas in communication that are extremely challenging to me. But I have some areas of communication that I do very, very well at. And the letters and words I think are all too small to read, but it basically is the outgoing communication between just being luck of the draw in the genes I got and with a lot of training. I've gotten pretty good at being able to communicate outward and get what I want across. But where I really struggle, and this is why it's undercover, because you don't see this part, I struggle trying to read your face, trying to read your body language, trying to recognize that you're done with the conversation and ready to move on, and I didn't even notice. And you can see on the social personal side, I'm much more challenged in that area. I'm not really good at all the social nuances and graces, and like a lot of the people that are neurodiverse, I actually end up leaning a lot on my wife to help me navigate through those areas. And when you look at me in the top section, you can see it's kind of, again, a little unusual in that I have some areas with virtually no impact, but I have quite a number of areas that I do struggle. But that's what lets me kind of slip under the radar, and for most people, they would never guess that I was an ASD lister until some major thing comes up, like a meltdown. So let's go to the next one. This explains another thing that I think is confusing to people because it works very different than it works in any other type of disease or syndrome. When we talk about the autism spectrum, we talk about low functioning and high functioning. And again, most people tend to think of that as being, you've got low functioning here and you got high functioning here. And as you move closer and closer to high functioning, that you're just impacted less with whatever that disease is. If you have a bad cold, you've got all the symptoms heavily. If you have a mild cold, you have all the symptoms lightly. Well, high functioning doesn't quite work that way. When they're saying high functioning, what we're really saying is the person is able to get by in the world relatively independently. And when we're saying low functioning, we're really just saying they need a lot of assistance and help in order to get by the world. We're not really saying what the traits are. These happen to be the traits that came from that radar map that we had just looked at, except charted out so you can see the individual ones. And even though I would be definitely considered on the very high functioning side, and like I say, to the point that I can often slip by that nobody would know if I don't tell them and we don't run into a critical type situation, I have a huge amount of challenges. And that's the part to always remember is even though you're dealing with somebody who is super high functioning, that doesn't mean that they don't have some symptoms that are huge challenges to them. They're just not the ones that cause an impediment in daily life. And another thing to really point out is I by no means am a standard or a perfect example of what an ASD lister would be like, just like none of you are the perfect example of what an average human is. There's a saying in the autism world that says, if you've met one person that has autism, you've met one person. They're all different. So don't assume because I've talked to you and you say, geez, I met this high-functioning guy and he seemed to talk really well, so what's your problem? Well, it could be they're impacted totally differently than I am, but they're still high-functioning in all other areas. Let's go to the next slide. Geek's Guide to Interviews is the book that Professor had talked about that I had written. And I just wanted to go a little bit into, what were the motivations and what were the goals of actually producing it. And I have to say, the reason that I started doing it, the reason almost sounds to me even a little weak, but nonetheless, it is the reason that I started doing it. And it was, my wife and I both decided we were looking to do some career switching. And the career switch that I decided I was trying to pursue was in going into the area of speaking and training. But I didn't know what area I wanted to speak and train about. So as we worked through these various courses, sooner or later you had to actually do something, produce something. And I thought a book was within the realm that I felt comfortable undertaking. So once I had decided a book, now it got a little easier. I just looked at what is it that I do pretty well, that I think I can explain my approach easily, and also that I have access to some other experts that I can get some other inputs. So it came to interviewing because with my consulting career, I've interviewed probably more than most people do in a lifetime in the last 5 years. And at one point, I had actually gone a string of 14 interviews getting the job offer for every one of those 14. So I guess I can do okay in an interview. So that was really the whole why I was doing it. The why was simply to prove to myself that I could write some useful material that was helpful to other people that struggled with some of the same things I struggled with. But the motivation was entirely different. That one comes much closer to the heart. And my motivation really was these people, these neurodiverse that tend to live in all the tech arenas, are the people that gave me and helped me have a wonderful career. And I saw where they were challenged and struggling in areas that I wasn't. And I wanted to give back to those people that gave so much to me. And then kind of a second thing I wanted was some way to help the HR and the people who are doing the interview process to understand how much we have to essentially fake looking normal in order to get through an interview, because it's not the way that we think and process the different pieces. So that was the other motivation was, hopefully it would get into a few hands like it has, and it's been amazing that both sides, both the neurotypicals and the neurodiverse, have read it and gotten quite a bit of value out of the material. So that was the motivation and the reasons. So I guess next slide. This is what I call the neurodiverse hiring model. And I'm going to do it up here on the board because I got to get my colored markers out again last night and I had a lot of fun with them. So I'll start breaking this down. I mean, we've got 4 quadrants and hopefully the great metallic colors come through on the camera. And I refer to them as obviously gold. I mean, that's the employee everybody wishes they could hire. They're brilliant, they communicate well, they do everything. Silver, bronze, and to me, or, that simply means maybe someday we can train them and teach them to be a great employee, but right now we just got raw material to work with. Then the other things to kind of pay attention here is this scale going this way is the person's hireability. In other words, how likely would you hire that person if you were interviewing them? And I have it going from scary to the type of person that you interview. I mean, you're even scared to be in the same room with them. They're so crazy. To the superstar that you just want them because they are so good. The other thing that I've charted on here is their actual work job performance. And it goes from, I just say dead, somebody that just never seems to get done what they need to get done, of course, all the way through to, the miracle worker, the person that if there's a crunch, if there's a problem, they're going to get it solved, they're going to figure it out, they're going to handle it somehow. Now, what I think often goes on, and I'd say more than often, like almost always, is we look at these two attributes when we're interviewing, which would be how well does the person communicate? And the better they communicate, the further we're pushing them along the scale of what we would consider a superstar. And how are their social skills? How are they interacting with us? And again, same thing. The further along they are in interacting with us, the more we consider them a superstar. So the traditional interviewing process is really rewarding neurotypical traits of sociability and communication. What ends up happening, though, is you can get somebody who is very social and communicates very well, but they're dead. They have no job skills because the job skill is a tiny bit of the evaluation. Almost everybody's evaluating by these two measures. And that's one of the big challenges and one of the big problems right now in the interview process for the neurodiverse, is we filter them out. What I think we need to be looking at a little more is really curiosity and creativity. Einstein said that curiosity is more important than intelligence. And it's a really good indicator. If you have somebody who is curious and they're creative, they're going to become able to come up with some very imaginative solutions and be a tremendous contributor in just ideas and working through things. So I think what we should really be doing is deciding what is it that we're interviewing for. Is this a position that the person really has to have tremendous communication skills? In which case we're going to look at these two scales, get over here, and now we know to look for these two. Bang, we're going to pick somebody in the gold scale. But there's so many positions in the corporate and technology world that don't need that face time. They don't need the communication ability. They don't need that social ability to that level. And the silver medalist over here, that is the miracle hidden workers that nobody's competing for because they don't necessarily communicate real well and or their social interactions may not be top rate. But they're phenomenal performers. So they work really, really well. Say it's cybersecurity. They never talk to the end customer. They're sitting talking to a computer all day. Why do we worry if they have great communication? Why don't we find one of these who's unemployed right now or is working in a low-level job because everybody passed them up because they didn't hit on these scales? So that's why I call it the neurodiverse hiring model, is we really should start factoring in what it is that gives somebody that advantage. And the advantage from the neurodiverse is really in that creativity, that curiosity, because our brains work different, because we think and see things differently. We can bring a lot of that to the table that a lot of other people can't. I think we go to the next slide now. So what are some of the challenges to job hunting? We've already kind of looked at here, what are the challenges in the interview process? Well, there's more challenges for the neurodiverse getting employed than just the interview process. And some of the challenges are you start with, it's not uncommon for people that are neurodiverse to have less than an ideal resume. And I happen to be a perfect example of that. I have what most people, and probably you would consider when you're looking at it also, a spotty resume. I tend to work lots of very short-term jobs, which normally that's considered a bad sign. Well, there's two reasons for my resume looking that way. One is I've been doing consulting, and my preference is to do short-term, high-difficulty jobs because A, I like the challenge, and B, they pay better. So that's part of why I have a lot of turnover on my resume. But the other part is, as I started out, that wasn't the only time I've been fired. So I have a bunch of turnover also because of the issues of keeping a neurodiverse person employed, which we're going to go over some of those also. So that gives a weak resume. Another reason often that they have a weak resume is if they have difficulty interviewing. They may have graduated from the finest institution with just top grades in the exact field you need, but if they can't get through the interview process, you go work where you have to. So they have Starbucks on there. They have jobs that are well below their capacity. But again, when you get an interview, you get a resume and you're looking for somebody in the technology field, and you see all they've done is Starbucks and some low-level kind of jobs. That's not the candidate that you think is going to have what you need. So that's one of the struggles, is the resumes are weak. Another struggle they have is they don't understand what the goals are in the interview. Now, it would seem like it should be pretty straightforward to figure out what the goal of the interview is. The goal of the interview is to get a job. But the problem is there's not clarity of what is required to get that job, because the neurodiverse person is thinking the way the neurodiverse person thinks, which is not the way that the neurotypical person, which again, we said that's what most people are. So most of the interviewers who aren't technical people are on the other side. And to give an example of unclear goals, when I started working on Geek's Guide to Interviews, I got a bunch of my buddies and we went out for lunch. And these are all people in the technology world. They're all very, very, very good, as a matter of fact, quite high level. And we just went around the table and I asked them, what is it that you have the greatest challenge with when you're interviewing? And there was one answer I got that just explains this one so well. And what he said was, I just struggle with trying to get the non-technical people to understand the level of my skills. Well, is that the goal? I mean, when you think about it, why is he trying to convince a non-technical person how phenomenally good he is at tech when the normal interview process is you get a tech interview. That person signs off and says, yes, they have the qualifications. Then you go into the business people and they say, yes, we like them, they can work with them, all those things. So trying to convince the business people that you're a great technologist is a waste of the time, because that's not what they want to hear. They believe their tech person that already interviewed you was correct, that you have the skills, because they can't judge anyways. They're not technologists. So unclear interview goals. He's trying to convince him how great he is instead of telling him how much he would enjoy working there and loves the challenge and what the company does, which would be a much better answer to get through most interview processes. Then poor social communication skills. And this one kind of hits in some interesting and unusual ways. One of the first ways that it really affects is most people have a network. So when they're out job searching, you've got a network. You've got, in your cases, you've gone to school with a bunch of people. Some start getting jobs in places. You reach out to your friends and you say, hey, is there any openings there? Can you give me an introduction? Can you get my resume to somebody? As you get further in your careers, you have people, they move to companies, you stay in touch and you build that network up. Well, us on the neurodiverse side, first off, if we've got a short resume, we haven't had the chance to build that. Secondly, we have a tendency that our friends are the people we're working with. And when we change jobs and go off to another job, that's it. That's our new group of friends, and we don't stay in touch with the old ones. It's not that we didn't like them, but out of sight, out of mind kind of is the way it works for us. So they have a real small network to draw upon. Poor answers. This would be something such as, you ask, do you know how to do XYZ program? And again, this is a business person. They don't want, great detail, but they're just asking the question, do you know how to do this program? Because we use it. And very frequently from somebody who's neurodiverse, you're going to get an answer that is either yes or no. End of answer. Well, if it's yes, you got at least a little something to go on. But if it's no, you just assume the person probably doesn't have qualifications. But what if they learned the strategy to answer of saying, no, I don't know XYZ, but I know PDQ, which is the biggest competitor, and works about the same way, so I'm sure I could learn ABC real fast based on my skills with PDQ. Is that going to play better in an interview than saying no? I think so. And another one that really trips up is, it's not uncommon for people who are neurodiverse, which also is common in people who are not neurodiverse. And that's where, again, the cloud, because these things are not only in one place or the other. And it's long processing time. And it's just more common amongst the neurodiverse than amongst neurotypicals. And by long processing time, what I mean is, how many times have you been in a situation where you have an interaction with somebody and you go away, and 10 minutes later, the perfect idea of how you should have answered or what you wish you said comes to you? Well, if that's how you process the world normally, great. You come up with the perfect answer for the interview after you've left the interview, and you just had a crappy one when you were at the interview. So that's another huge process. Problem of getting through the job hunt is, if you have that type of person who needs to think through, and then you could write the world's best white paper on it, that's not going to get you through an interview very well. Let's go to the next slide. The next thing we're going to deal with is, what are some of the challenges as somebody who is neurodiverse to stay employed? And there's quite a few, because overall, because neurotypicals are the majority of the world, the rules tend to be written to favor neurotypicals. So some of the different things that cause problems, we're going to start with honesty kills. Now, we were all taught, since we were young, that we should be telling the truth, that we should be honest. But we also know that there's a level of social skill that says sometimes it's better not to tell the whole truth. If your boyfriend or girlfriend or significant, relationship of whatever type asks you, am I looking fat? A good answer is probably not yes. But as a neurotypical or diverse kind of person, I would just probably say yes. We have a tendency to not have a good filter. What comes to our mind is what we say, whether it's appropriate or not, because we don't process the emotional content of it. We just process the words. We take the literal words. You asked this question, I gave you the answer. I didn't feel or think or even relate to how you would react to that answer. So honesty can kill. And I'll give you an example here, and this is again another example of how Tim got fired another time. And I was working for a company, and actually I was a consultant brought in for this company, and there was another consultant brought in that she was supposedly this super high level that had worked on the Microsoft Business Intelligence Development team. And she was supposed to, in that field, just about walk on water. And that's the field I also work in. So she was brought in to be the architect and the designer of everything, and I was brought in to essentially do the grunt work and grind through all that stuff. Well, working with her, it didn't take me very long to figure out that that guru was a fraud. she didn't actually know. She knew the words. She could sound really good to somebody who didn't really know the technology, and she could tell a great story. She was kind of like in that interviewing thing. She was really great at communicating and could use the right words, but she actually didn't know how to do the stuff. And when I recognized that, I felt my obligation isn't to her, my obligation is to the people that are paying me. So I started challenging her in meetings. When she would say something that was blatantly wrong, I would call her out on it. Well, that didn't go over very well. Then it got to the point where if she started getting cantankerous when I called her out on it, I'd just get up and leave the meeting. Again, not what I would call the best way to handle things, but it was that or I was going to kill her. So it was probably better that I got out of the room. And then it finally got to the point where I actually went to the CTO of the company and sat down and told him, this woman is a fraud. She doesn't know what she's doing. Well, he was the person that had actually hired her. And what he took out of that was I was a problem because his guru is a guru. He knows it. He hired her. And the net result was I got fired. But I did get a little vindication in the long run because about a month later, the recruiter reached out and called me and said they let the guru go and they wanted to know if I'd go back to the job. Well, another thing that you should learn about the neurodiverse is if we can't respect somebody, we have a big problem working for them. And you can certainly imagine what my respect was for this guy after I got canned. So, no, I did not go back. Another problem with staying employed is meltdowns. Now, meltdowns are probably best described as they look like a tantrum. If you were to see somebody acting this way, you would probably say they're throwing a tantrum. But there's a big difference between a meltdown and a tantrum. And what that big difference is, why is it happening and is there an intent behind it? The reason you throw a tantrum is you're trying to manipulate people to do something. The reason you have a meltdown is you've had a brain overload and it's a lot like having a seizure. Not that it's physically like a seizure, but it's the kind of thing that once it starts, you cannot stop it. You have to just let it run the course. So, big difference, meltdown, tantrum is, are you really trying to accomplish and manipulate, or are you simply, your brain went offline and you're just melting? That's the difference. The problem is, most companies' policies will fire you for having a meltdown at work. Where is the area that most of us tend to have the most stress on us at any given time? It's going to be at work. So where are we going to most likely melt down? At work. Give you an example, and this is another example of Tim getting fired. This is actually a really strange kind of combination. I was put at a company A to extract company B's data while I was being paid by company B, who was a customer company A. But company A wouldn't give them the data they wanted even though they were a customer. They just said, you put a person here and you can get it yourself, but we won't do it for you. So kind of a little strange scenario. I'm sitting in the offices of people who didn't want to give up data doing this work. High pressure, they had messed up the company that was originally doing it, had kind of made some bad hires initially, and they were already 3 months behind. So we had a very fast-track project. It had huge pressure. We're down to the day of deploying. We're on the call in the morning as we're kind of making sure we're all in alignment. And the customer liaison, basically, I took it as he insulted me. And he might not have meant it that way, but I took it that way, which I already didn't like the guy. That really pissed me off. But I needed to get this thing rolled out, so I just kind of stuffed it and kept working. Well, when I got done and got the deployment done and it was working and it was running and we were successful, I called my project manager, who was only part-time on this project, so he was not on site. And I totally unloaded on him. I mean, I just kind of like melted down and lots of nasty stuff came out of my mouth about not about the project manager, but about the customer liaison and how screwed up the project was and all those things. So I vented, I got it off my chest, I hung up and finished up my work and went home. And I get a phone call that says, don't go back tomorrow, you're banned from the building. And if you can't go back in the building, we're dropping you from the project. What had happened was somebody that was in the cubes near me felt threatened because I was yelling in the phone at my project manager. And they went to HR, and HR followed the policy. If there's somebody who seems threatening, and you don't keep them around. So there's an example where I had a meltdown, which is a normally expected thing among neurodiverse, and should be accommodated because this does fall under ADA compliance. And instead, you get fired. So that's another area that often the neurodiverse have challenges staying employed is if you have a meltdown at work, is that going to make you the person that they fire? And then we kind of brushed on this one already, and that's the what comes out of our mouth. And the way that one usually works is it's kind of like the woman that was on the first slide that was looking at the computer with the look in her face that she's just totally aghast. And when you get out in the corporate world, you're going to run into this. You're going to run into neurodiverse people that are going to say things that they're 100% correct. They may even be appropriate for the time, but the way they're said is 100% inappropriate. Instead of saying to you, well, what's going on with the computer when they're trying to help you fix it, they walk up and they say, what'd you do to the computer? Which certainly doesn't sit real well. It makes you feel like they're accusing you of breaking the darn thing. So that gets you a reputation as being not the kind of person we want to keep around a company. So those are just some of the real challenge areas for the neurodiverse to stay employed. So let's go on to the next slide. The reason I was fired at the first, where I started in the beginning and was making the call to my wife, this was another meltdown scenario. And I'll kind of give you the setup of how this one occurred. And I was working for a company. It was a very, very large company that does an online educational platform. And they had 33 development groups in this one building. My particular specialty is the database and data warehouse area. Very often in the work they were doing interface work and that kind of stuff that needed no database work. Because of that, they would do what they referred to as matrixed, which means we had multiple teams that we were the person that did the database work for those multiple teams. Usually it worked pretty well because most of the time the stuff they did didn't need it, so you usually only had one team or maybe one with something going kind of slow on the side for another team. Well, I happened to be in a position where I had a team that had some very high profile pieces they needed to be done, and they needed to do some things that were not within the normal policy and procedures of how this company did things. And I told them I would get the meeting arranged because it involved a lot of the people that I worked more directly with. And it took me 2 weeks to get this meeting lined up. Now, another group that I'm working with had a project manager that was new. I didn't have a whole lot of respect for because he was kind of obnoxious. And he had already failed his deployments twice. So this is now, they just tried deploying and they failed for the third deployment. He comes over to me with his hair on fire 5 minutes before I'm supposed to walk into this meeting that I made what I felt a personal commitment for, and took me 2 weeks to set up, and tells me I need to cancel that meeting and go bail him out because this is so important and they failed 3 times now and they're going to be in all kinds of trouble because of all the fails. Well, I didn't particularly feel that, my responsibility laid with bailing out the idiot that failed 3 times, who I didn't like anyways. I felt the responsibility was of this team that I promised 2 weeks ago, and it took 2 weeks to get this meeting together. And he pushed, I pushed back, he pushed, I melted down. Again, foul stuff came out of my mouth. Next morning I show up, and it's the clear out the desk and get escorted to the door. He went to HR and complained about me that, again, meltdown, falls against the whole policy. He's not safe, he's whatever, he's deranged, he's mentally ill, who knows what he said. End result was, I was out of a job. So another case of, how in a company, there was a very bad structure. They had a structure where nobody was managing who I should be working for. It was kind of a free-for-all, 6 teams, yank at them however you want. Well, that's a very bad setup when you're working with a neurodiverse. We tend to be poor at prioritizing. We miss a lot of the subtleties. We don't understand that if the boss gave it to you, that's more important than if somebody else gave it to you. We just base it on what's the most important thing to do based on the logic of how we think about it. Go to the next slide. Really, what this is trying to illustrate is the way I see that you need to kind of build up skills in somebody who is neurodiverse in order to create a good worker. And for me, the foundation of it is the work ethic and a work culture. The person needs to understand what a good work ethic is, and they need to understand what the culture in a company is. Because culture in companies is very different than culture in college, which was very different than culture in high school. And unfortunately, nobody teaches what corporate etiquette and culture is like. We're just supposed to know when we get there. And being neurodiverse, tending to be impacted in that ability to pick up on emotional and subtle cues, we don't do a good job of learning that later, and nobody teaches it up front, but I think we should. Then as you move up to the next level, I think the next level is once you've got that foundation that they understand what a work ethic is and how companies work, is to start teaching them technical skills. If that's appropriate, if they're more the artistic type, good, get them into the artistic skills. But pick whatever it is that they're gifted in and start teaching those skills. Then particularly if they're going into the technology field, one of the super important things in the technology field is being able to teach yourself and learn by yourself. And that's because it changes so fast. In the IT world where I work, in 6 months you can totally change from being this program to this program. And they don't send you off to school to learn it, they just tell you, get going on it. And you need to learn yourself. So that's another thing, teach people how to learn themselves, I think is the next level up. And that really, I call it outpacing the pack. If you've learned some tech and then you can learn how to learn yourself, you're already 3 steps ahead of most of the rest of the pack. And then at the top, I actually put those social and communication interactions. What I refer to as pleasing the aliens. And the reason I put that at the top, not at the bottom, which at the bottom is where we tend to put them in companies right now. I put it at the top because you can have, again, that silver medalist type person. They don't have good communication skills, they don't have good social interaction skills, but they're phenomenal at their job work. So they could be a great employee. So that's why I put that at the top. Learning that first doesn't help you if you don't have the other pieces. Then the other piece that you really just need to always think and be aware of is oftentimes it's not that the person doesn't want to learn the thing, it's that they don't have the capacity to learn it. It's thought that in autism, which is what I deal with, that we lack what they call the mirror neurons. Those are the neurons that fire off that help me interpret what it is that you're saying and then what your body language is saying. That means that no matter how much you try and teach me to read that stuff, I'm missing a piece of the mechanics to actually do that. So I can get better because I can learn it as a cognitive kind of skill. But the problem is, as soon as you get frustrated, you get mad, you get upset, that goes offline. Whereas most of you probably learned those skills when you're 5 and 6 years old or so, and they're just ingrained in you. It's just you, that's how you react normally, as opposed to it being a skill you learned later in life where you've got to think about it, and if you can't think, you can't do it. So how do we take and build a good neurodiverse worker, starting out from if it was a kid, moving on through? What would be some of the good things to do to allow somebody to develop a well lung if it's found that they're neurodiverse when they're young? And kind of broke it up here. We're building from the bottom to top, so it reads a little backwards for most charts, but again, it matches the stack of what do you need to do first and as you go through. First thing is really in the childhood area. If at all possible, if you think that, as you start running into friends that have kids or you have kids, if you think that there's an issue, get it checked as soon as you can, because it's been proven that if you can intervene when the child is, 2, 3 years old, you can build a lot of these skills in through special education and through special help so that they become innate like they are for most of you, as opposed to being cognitive like they are for me. I didn't tell you, but I actually only found out that I had Asperger's 3.5 years ago. I was 54 years old and I found out why I had a disaster in my life. So it wasn't until then that I actually started learning some of these skills. So you can see, big difference if you can get it when they're 2 or 3 so they can innately have it versus having to learn it when you're 54. And another thing is, and this one, Temple Grandin, which I imagine you're familiar with, she's one of the best known autistic people around. She and I were talking, and this is something she just harps on and told me that I always have to say whenever I talk about it. And she's right. And what that is, one of the best things you can do to build up a kid into being a good neurodiverse worker is to get them to work for somebody else when they're about 10, 12 years old. And by work, it can be as simple as walking the neighbor's dog. The idea, though, is simply getting them to reporting to somebody else besides their family with something that will give them some money so they can learn the satisfaction and joy of working. And it will also make them be responsible, and they'll have to learn responsibility because they have to go walk the dog at certain times. The person will call them out if they don't. Very, very important. It builds those, what you saw I had at the bottom of the pyramid, those foundational skills, just by getting them to work while they're young. As you move up into, mid-teen area, that's where the workplace culture part comes in. Why aren't we taught when we're in high school or, along the way, this is how companies are, this is how companies work? Why do they make us go in and have to figure it out ourselves? Just doesn't seem like a good way to go. So I think we should be starting to teach more workplace culture outside of the workplace. Then another thing that I think is real important as you get into that mid-teen is whatever the person's special interest is. And it's very common amongst the neurodiverse that we have, well, if you don't know better, people call it an obsession. We call it a special interest. We're not obsessed, we just love it so much that we like doing it a lot. For me, at one point, it was the bicycle industry, and that then gave me a career in the bicycle industry for 20 years. And then it went on to being computers, and that's given me another 20-year career because I became a computer freak. Along the way, I got involved with doing metalworking and machining, and that's why I went and started a manufacturing company and designed all kinds of products. So you can see with the neurodiverse, it's frequently that special interest that gives the special skills. So if they're showing a special interest, now's the time to get them starting to develop it while they're young. Then teen and adult, the last things to really have to deal with is, first, comorbidities. And comorbidities, again, a medical term, and what it means are conditions that appear along with another condition. And 2 of the most common comorbidities for autism spectrum disorder is anxiety and depression. Well, if any of you have ever had anxious moments, you know what anxiety feels like. Well, imagine if you felt like that 7/24. How are you going to react when people come up and deal with you? Not real well. When you're anxious, you don't tend to handle things well. And you have people that don't handle things well already because they don't have good social skills. So those 2 especially, the anxiety and the depression, it's got to be dealt with if it exists. Whether it requires medication, whether it's meditation, whether, whatever the methodology is, and there's a huge range of methods to approach it, it needs to be dealt with, because until you get those out of the way, you can't really get to the root problem. And for me, it was anxiety. And it wasn't until I ended up into a psychiatrist's office after a breakdown that they took care of and got the anxiety under control, that they then found out what was driving it all underneath is I have Asperger's. So again, that will hide it very often. So you got to deal with those things. And then the last thing I have is verbal communication. And by verbal communication, I mean a lot more than just talking. This is kind of a super secret ninja area that most people are never aware of. And I mean neurotypical or neurodiverse. And I have been very, very fortunate to work with one of the best vocal coaches in the world. And he has a methodology of teaching where he breaks the voice into 5 components of your voice. And then he goes through and teaches you how to manipulate those components. But the big part is he then does what he calls vocal profiles. And he'll tell you for any situation when you're trying to you're trying to ask for a date. How should you sound when you're trying to ask for a date? Sounding like this, asking for a date, doesn't sound like somebody you want to ever kiss, does it? No, I mean, if you're asking for a date, you want to sound like you're interesting and you're alluring and there's something exciting and mysterious about you. And all of that is just vocal training. It's rare, but it is the most amazing thing, and it has done more than probably anything else to help me connect better with the rest of the world. So I have to harp on it. And my guy, if you just want to look him up, because he's pretty interesting, his name is Roger Love, rogerlove.com. I think you'll find it is some real interesting stuff. So I guess we have next slide. This one is really just showing, I think companies are at different levels as far as how they're doing on embracing the neurodiverse. And we start with, at the bottom, you got flat out discriminators. They just plain discriminated against them. Obviously, that's bad. Nobody wants to work there. And when you look at what does a candidate interviewing and how much does the company get out of the people, I call it in the hole. It's a -10. Nobody wants to work for somebody who's a blatant discriminator. You move to the next step up, and I think this is where most of the companies are today. And that's just plain unaware. They just don't know. They're not blatantly discriminating. They just don't know there's something they should be aware of. And I think that, again, that's where the majority are. And I think we need to get them over the line, and you're the generation that's going to be able to do it because you're bringing the fresh ideas in. It's a whole lot harder to get the ones that are already there to know that, get them to change how they do things. You got your HR systems all set up. You like the way they work. You don't want to change it. You bring in somebody new. They bring in new ideas. So I'm looking for you guys all to bring this one out. So you go up to the next level of just awareness. Even that's a big step forward. At least you're aware that there's this concept. You're aware of different things. You haven't changed policies. You've just created awareness. Then as you move further up, you're really into the how do you start accommodating these people? How do you make it easier for them to get through the process? And at the top, the ones that are the real, leaders are how do you go out and actually enable these people to bring the innovation that your company wants? So how do you empower them? And kind of, here I've got a couple of things of, how it works. Awareness side, in the material you had ahead of time, you saw the alien universe where it was the 2 circles and how they overlap, and you can only communicate in that overlap area because otherwise, they don't understand the opposite sides because it's not within their vision. Recognizing the difference. That's really the biggest thing with awareness, is getting that out, that idea that you can only communicate in the parts that you can agree on. Moving up to accommodating. How about if you give the person ahead of time a map of what the interview process is going to be? It's this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. That helps a huge amount for the person. Takes a lot of stress, pulls that anxiety down. Expect an ND answer. Expect a neurodiverse answer. Expect that they're going to say no, that they don't know the program, and know that you should ask at that point, well, do you know any similar programs? So you're kind of helping them a little bit because you know the way they're tending to answer. And I mean, this idea of 3 degrees of interest, which we might make it through, or we might not, we'll see. Which really just comes down to there's 3 levels of information, and the problem is if you don't get them to understand the level that you want them to talk at, you're going to be talking at 2 different levels and not have communication. Then in empowering, those top companies, they're doing things like online job fairs, task-based interviews. Give somebody a simple task of what it is that you're wanting them to do and see how they do it instead of doing a verbal, quiz interview. And then some of them are even implementing workshop type interviews. They bring them in, they teach them a technology that's related to what they need them to do, but easy to teach in a short time, and then they see how they do it. And that is the interview right there. It's a full hands-on involving actually technology. And that starts enabling people and empowering them. Let me go to the next slide. This is the concept of the 3 degrees of interest. And the way it starts out is you've got the smallest circle, which is either social or in the tech world, I refer to it as user story. So think of it as you run into somebody at a party and you ask them, what do they do? You don't want to hear all about every little detail of what they do. You just want to hear, I'm a computer programmer, I work as an engineer, I'm an HR specialist, that's all you want to hear when you're at a party. So that's the social level. Then we go up to the next level where we're getting into more details. There's just more information to know. And I refer to that as the decision, or again, in the IT world or engineering world, it's the requirements. We're now starting to bring this world towards implementation. If we want to make a decision on something, we need to know more than simply, say we met 2 dentists at a party. Well, we want to know more than simply they're both dentists before we start picking. So we need more details. If we're going to write requirements, we need a little bit of technical added in. Then the 3rd level you get to is simply the do it level, and for, again, in the tech world I live in, that's the code level. And that's the deepest level. And I mean, at that point, you're down in the weeds building the little individual pieces, and that's where your head is. And that's where most of us neurodiverse live, is we live in here. So the important thing is if you simply let the person know, okay, there's these 3 levels, and I want you to talk to me and answer me at this social kind of level. How do you like doing reporting? I don't want to hear about the programs that you do. I just want to hear about, yeah, that's something I like. I do a really good job. I've done this one. It was a great thing. So that you've helped them understand. Or maybe you want the technical answer and tell them, I want at the code do it level. Tell me how XYZ works. So right there will give a big advantage. And the other thing it does is it tells you how to communicate that information. If you're talking about tech details and you're down here at this level, you should use none. But if we're talking about code, it's going to be all tech details. And in the middle, we're going to have some tech and some, amount in there. The other thing, though, is story. When you think about it, social or user story, that's why they call it a user story, is told in a story format. I'm doing this and I want it to do this, and when I do this I want something to come out in the printer. That's a user story, nothing technical about it. If we're down here, we should be telling it in story format because people relate to that. But if we're working up here in the code level, we better not be telling a whole much story, we better be talking a whole lot of tech. So the 3 degrees of interest gives you 2 different pieces. First off, a way to talk to somebody about telling them what level do you looking for this information. And secondly, for you, it tells you how should you be telling that information. Or you should be telling it in a story format, or you should be telling it in a tech format, or in a mixed format. I think next slide. Which means we've hit the end. I really hope, my biggest goal in this was really to try and give you a little glimpse into the head of us neurodiverse. So I'd like to open it up for what time we have left. Any questions?
Okay. My name is Mitch Felder, and I'm a junior the ILR school year.
Hey, Mitch.
You mentioned getting fired multiple times. So how did you manage getting new employment with a record of getting fired? How did you explain that to employers?
Well, as I said, I'm what a lot of people refer to as a undercover Aspie. If you didn't know better, you would have no idea. So all I had to do was come up with a good reason of why I was changing jobs so much, because they had no clue what it really was, because they didn't see what caused it. And because I was working in a consulting career, it was real simple. I just tell them all, I like short-term jobs that are high challenge that pay a lot of money. And they all go, oh, that makes sense. So I spun it. That's, what do you do? And you take what you got and you spin it the best way you can. But unfortunately, a lot of the neurodiverse don't have that communication skill. That's one of the areas where I feel very fortunate. But it also allows me to bring the information to you, so it's kind of a secret gift. That answer? Cool. And for everybody else, if there's a question that A, you don't want to ask publicly, or B, we just don't get to, go to my website, put it in the contact form. It comes only to me, and I will reply back. It might be a few days. I got a hectic schedule, but I will answer you. Any else?
Hi, Tim. My name is Michael. I'm a senior in the Iowa School. Thank you for speaking with us. On employment forms, at least most of the ones that I've filled out recently, there's an option to self-identify as someone with a disability. What's your opinion on that, and how do employers normally react to that?
Well, I'm going to put it this way. This is the professor got to hear this too, because it was at the Autism at Work. And if I remember right, it was John Elder Robinson, who was another autistic speaker, who's a professor, very high performing. And the way he put it is, if you're neurodiverse and you were to go ask somebody in companies, it's much like going into a company in the 60s and asking all the gay people to stand up. Why would you identify yourself? There was no advantage in the 60s to say that you were. Matter of fact, there was a lot of disadvantage. And that's unfortunately the way it is in companies right now. What advantage do I have of revealing that I'm going to be a problem? Unless they happen to be one of the few companies that are actually going out and trying to recruit people like me. So you go to, Microsoft, HP, Enterprise, and Ernst Young, and all the Autism at Work group. That one I would actually divulge to. But to most companies, there's only negative and there's no positive to saying it. Now, on the other hand, because I'm, going out and speaking about it, and I'm a, neurodiverse communication expert, it's all over my website. As soon as they look me up, they're going to know. So I do divulge all the time, even though often it counts against me, because they're going to find out with me because I got it everywhere.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I'm a sophomore in the College of Arts and Sciences. My question is, what was your initial reaction to your diagnosis? Was it relief or stress? And have you met a lot of individuals who also had late in life diagnoses, and did they feel similar ways?
I'm going to maybe answer that a little backwards. I'm going to start with the late in life diagnoses. Essentially, anybody that's over about 30 probably never got diagnosed, because in the school systems, they didn't start, just medically, we didn't really start understanding it well enough that they could even diagnose it in the school systems. So it wasn't until really the early 90s that they started catching it, which means if you're over 30, you probably got missed. What happens is one of two things. Either you never get diagnosed and you struggle and never know why. And it's like anything. If you don't understand what's causing it, how do you do anything about it? Or you're like me and you find out late in life because you're over 30 already and you get diagnosed. So that's the late in life part is, most of the people who are over 30, if they are diagnosed, it will be late in life, but very few of them get diagnosed. They just struggle and suffer and never know why. Okay, now the first part of your question that you asked that I forgot already was...
How did you feel when you first...
It was kind of interesting. It was a mixed feeling. I mean, there was a relief in that I now started understanding the path of my life of being able to succeed in multiple industries, but then fired. And started making some sense. On the other hand, I wasn't willing to talk about it. I mean, you know, with my family, yes, but I wasn't talking about it publicly. I wouldn't have, 3.5 years ago, I wouldn't have stood in front of you and told you I'm on the spectrum. That took a long while to grow into and feel comfortable with it. But no, overall, it was a big relief because, my wife and I were having severe marital issues, which is very common when you have an autistic partner with a non-neurodiverse and, not neurotypical together. It's very common to have relation problems. And we did. We were having relation problems. I obviously had job problems. So yeah, there was definitely a relief in suddenly being able to say, that's what it is. Now I can start working on it.
Thank you for your candor and your technical expertise and your terrific presentation style. It's very much appreciated. Please join me in thanking Mr. Goldstein for that.
Well, thank you very much.
Tim, we'll be back in touch for sure again.
Okay.
Your time.
Bye now.